focus on the next slide. Yeah, here it is. All right, so workers' compensation is insurance payments that are made to people who are injured on the job. And workers' comp is a public-private partnership between the state and insurance companies. It's too big of an issue for private insurance companies to handle alone, so the state jumps in and helps out. And there are very strict formulas, and it's kind of gross. If you lose a hand, you know, you get paid one thing. If you lose a finger, another thing. If you lose an arm up to your elbow, I mean, they got the formulas down. And I managed a portfolio for a workers' comp plan, and man, I got to hear lots of terrible conversations that went on that had to do with injuries, and also decisions about whether to keep someone on life-saving equipment. You know, it's like one of the worst claims they had was someone who was injured and had been on life support for like 18 months. And they couldn't get the family to pull the plug. And, you know, I mean, can you imagine if you're the family? But also, you know, they're talking about how expensive it was kicking their butts to pay for that round-the-clock care in the hospital. And I mean, how do you put a dollar sign on somebody's life? I don't know. You have to do it, but it's just really, really tough. But they went through that for a year and a half of, you know, begging the family, you know, let this man go. He's not coming back. So it's a tough thing. So this is a study of the cost of payroll, okay, the cost of employing people. And so a study was done, and it found that there was a relationship between the amount that was paid for payroll, and I'm sure there's a relationship between the amount that's paid for payroll and the number of people on the payroll. And maybe that's a more exact thing. And what about not just the people on the payroll, but the specific jobs they were doing? If you're Grant, if you're a roofer, your chances of injury are a lot higher than if you're an architect. Wouldn't you agree? So just looking at the overall payroll, that seems to be kind of a blunt instrument. There ought to be a better way. But anyway, they studied this number, this group of data, and this is the independent variable, okay? And this is the dependent variable. And they put together a regression equation. And this is what it looks like, okay? So if you multiply this number times the payroll number and then subtract that, you get an accurate number of claims, number of claims that are going to be made. Number of claims that will be made. Now, to me, what's interesting is that's just half of the equation, right? The number of claims. What's the other half?
How much it cost?
Yeah, the cost per claim. That wasn't included in here. Okay? So again, it depends. And I know, I used to know people who worked at the railroad. Ooh, man. There were lots of limb severings if you worked at the railroad. With those heavy cars would come in, and people would lose arms and legs and hands all the time, if you've ever known anybody who's worked for a railroad. Most of us, you know, aren't exposed to that kind of thing, but boy, every now and then you run into somebody and they tell you stories. All right, so the R square right here tells you how strong the cause and effect is. That in this particular case, 95% of this is explained by this. That's powerful. That's potent. You get down to 30 and 40 and 50%, it's like, there's not that much of a relationship there. But you get up here like this, and you're saying, man, I could use this data with great confidence and predict. And it's the same thing for every company. They can also predict using history, what the cost is going to look like. All right. I want to see how this looks at the bottom here. Yeah, I got it to pulsate there. It was tough to do that. It was fighting with me. All right. Okay, using a probability distribution, using a z-score. Okay, probability distribution. So I don't know that there's an example of this, but you can use a normal distribution, and if you have the mean and the standard deviation, then you can predict the likelihood of an event, whether it's low or high. And again, this is something you probably went over early on in your statistics course. This is usually, using a probability distribution, normal distribution is usually in the first month. Okay? All right? And I can tell you, in the investment business, we use this all the time. Mean variance analysis is what they call it. Using a normal distribution and standard deviation, the mean and standard deviation, to predict the likelihood of an outcome. What is the likelihood that the market will go up? What is the likelihood that the market will go down? What is the likelihood that the market will go up by a certain amount or go down by a certain amount? Okay. What is the likelihood that your portfolio will last you 20 years, given some certain inputs? That's what we do in financial planning all the time, is working with people to say, your likelihood of success here is 75%, and that's not high enough. It needs to be 85%, and here's what we're going to do to kick it up there. All right, so lastly, we'll look at the time value of money as we make decisions. Okay, which policy to choose. Again, like I said, it's kind of a hodgepodge of topics thrown into Chapter 4. It's a number of topics, and they're not necessarily related, like this one's not related to risk. All right, so this is making decisions, but again, to me it's interesting, okay? Using the time value of money when you're analyzing bids or risk control investment decisions. How much money to spend on risk control, okay? And again, what it amounts to is, what is the present value of the cost and what is the present value of the likely loss? And you spend until they're equal. You don't spend more money on loss control than you do on the loss. Okay? So we'll look at an interesting example here. All right. So we're looking at two policies, and we're trying to decide which one to buy. And this is very common. Okay? So one has a premium of $45,000 per year for 2 years. So the total cost is $90,000. $45,000 a year for 2 years. Okay? It has a deductible of $5,000 for each event. That means every time you have a loss, in addition to the $45,000 that you pay, you're going to have to pay the first $5,000 of the loss. Okay? The other policy has a premium of $17,500. So the premium is much lower, $35,000 for 2 years, than this. Well, what's the offset to that? You know what the offset is. Your deductible is going to be a whole lot higher. Okay? So it's $10,000. So the question is, which policy should you buy? Well, it depends on your time value of money, and it depends on how many events and losses you expect to have. Okay, so you have to, it's an educated guess. That's what business is. All right, so that's why it's so important to really pay attention in Math 1200 and in QBA. Because no one really likes those two classes and those skill sets, and so they are in very short supply. And if you can really get a handle on those skill sets, then you're going to be valuable to a company, because everybody else is like, I don't want to mess with that. All right, so you expect 12 losses of $5,000 each year. So that's $60,000 each year. All right. Or you expect 6 losses of $10,000 each year. All right, so these losses under the first policy won't cover any of it. Okay, the first policy will cover $5,000 for each of these, right? And the first policy will cover $10,000 for each of these. So this is a scenario of what you expect to happen. Then you have to determine how much it's going to cost you. Okay? What was the deductible on the? It was $10,000. So for the second policy, neither of these will be paid for. You're going to have to pay for all of these. You're going to have to pay for all of these, and you'll have to pay for $10,000 for each of these. Okay? So you can see that how these things are distributed will really determine which policy is best for you. Okay, so you can play with these all day long. And how exact are you going to be in forecasting these? Man, that's tough. All right, so let's look at it. Your cost of capital is 8%. So these are kind of fun problems to do, I think. All right, so which policy should you choose? So the net present value of policy A, and these are annuity due problems. So you're going to pay them at the beginning of the year. Your premium is all due up front. So the present value, the cost is $45,000 today, plus $45,000 discounted 8% a year from now, plus the cost of the losses, the deductibles. So you got 5,000, you got 12 times 5,000, and that happens over a year, so your cost of capital, it's an average, gets cut in half from 8% to 4%, because that's half. Because half of these will happen in the first half of the year, and half of these will happen in the second half of the year. Okay? All right. This is the second year. All right. Let's see how this all plays out. So these are the costs. You're only having to pay $5,000 from each loss. Okay? That's what this is. Okay? So every event that happens will cost you $5,000. And so the total cost to you under this scenario, the cost of your premiums plus the cost of your losses, $275, $276. Now, we're going to look at the cost of the second policy given the same scenario, okay, with a different deductible, different premium cost, and we will go with the policy that has the lowest cost. Okay? And again, that depends entirely on this number here and on these numbers here. So it's subject to change. It depends on the front end, this is your forecast, but if it doesn't work this way, your decision at the end might look a whole lot different than the decision you made at the beginning. You might look at it and go, man, I completely messed that up. So here's your premium cost, much lower, okay? Yes, sir?
What about if the deductible is the same as the amount of the loss for the event?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, it's the cost. This is your cost regardless. Is that what you're asking?
So you factor that in either way?
Do what? Yes, you're gonna have to pay this either way. That's why it's capped out at 5,000 each time. Okay? And really what you are insuring against is this and this. If your deductible's 5,000, then that's what you're insuring against. You know? All right. So now let's look at how policy B looks. It's going to look the same for these. It's for this and this. That's where it gets different. All right. So you can see if you compare this and this, they're the same for both policies. Okay? But now you get to the losses, the 10,000. Okay, so your deductible is 10,000, so you're going to have to pay all of that. So you're paying all of that, you're paying all of that, and you're paying 10,000 for each of these. Guaranteed. Okay? So you look at it and you go, wow, this sure looks good on the front end, 17,500 versus 45,000. But on the back end, it doesn't. So what you would have to do, if you said, I'm not going to insure at all, what's the present value? You'd have to simply add up the present value of all the losses, of paying for all the losses, and compare it to that. And if the present value of all the losses is less than this, you don't buy insurance. It's not worth it. This is really interesting. I enjoy looking at that. That's an interesting scenario when you start thinking through it. Okay. All right. So you choose the policy that costs you the least. Somebody might want to go through and see, I haven't done it, to see what the cost of the present value of the losses is. It's not difficult to do. All right. Okay. Big business. Everything is automated now. Lots of software out there. If you're a risk manager, there are risk management information systems out there. Okay. Just to know, just so you know, there are, if you're thinking about, and by the way, we're going to have a Zoom meeting on the 29th with a risk manager. Tuesday the 29th. He'll tell us about what he does. And, one thing you may want to do is, in advance of that meeting, is jot down some questions for him. And that might be one of the questions. Tell us about the technology tools that y'all have that help you do your job. All right. I don't know that we asked the question. Value at risk is something that has been in the news the last few years, really the last 10 years, going back to banking. The government got involved and the regulators got involved in determining how bad it could get for the banks. How much could they lose? And the government and the regulators needed to know that so that they could understand the financial risk that they were dealing with and decide where to put up the barriers, where to say stop. You can't take any more risk than that because we can't afford to make it right. So value at risk. What's the worst dollar risk that could happen? Okay, and then what's the likelihood of that, and what is the best way to treat that? Okay, so this was really big in banking, and it had to do with the bank's loan portfolio and the bank's investments portfolio. Looking at both portfolios and say, how bad could it get? If things got really bad, how much would the government have to contribute to bail you out? Okay, it's a worst case scenario. And again, that's why you insure. Low frequency, high cost losses are best treated with insurance. And then the question becomes, is it a private sector insurable event or is it a public sector insurable event? So the wildfires on the West Coast, that's a public sector thing. An individual state cannot deal with it. They're not large enough. Okay? The flooding that is going to take place from this hurricane coming in, that's a public sector and a private sector event. Okay. All right, some of this is, kind of redundant. Everybody's seen The Day After Tomorrow. You've seen the catastrophe modeling. Quaid, what's his name? What's his first name? I love that guy. Not Randy Quaid. He's from the Vacation movies. What's his name?
Is it Dennis Quaid?
Dennis Quaid. Yeah, I love him. All right. Once again, this is. This goes back to other chapters where we looked at the underwriting cycle. How many times do we have to see it? You'll see at least one question on the exam about the underwriting cycle. How about that? Good enough for you to know. Okay. So this, and also you'll see this combined ratio when we get into the chapter on financial analysis of insurance companies, looking at balance sheets and income statements. Okay. So the combined ratio is the claims that have to be paid plus all the expenses, the staff associated with the underwriting function, which is determining, the underwriting function is determining what risks to cover and how much to charge. So you got big staff involved. So that's the total cost of running the insurance company, and you divide that into the total premiums that you charge. And it's called the combined ratio. And of course, you want this to be less than this, which in this case would be anything less than 1. A ratio less than 1 is what you're looking for. That means you're charging more than it's costing you. Okay? So greater than 1, the insurance company is losing money on the underwriting.